Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you this evening to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives for our program on the Jewish Justices of the Supreme Court, from Brandeis to Kagan, with author David Dalin. Whether you're here in the McGowan Theater or watching on our YouTube station or C-SPAN, thank you for joining us. We're presenting this program in partnership with the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington and the Supreme Court Historical Society, and we thank them for their support. After tonight's conversation, Dr. Dalin will be signing copies of his book in the lobby. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you about two programs coming up soon in this theater. On Tuesday, May 23rd at noon, Marie Jenkins Schwartz will be here to talk about her new book, Ties That Bound: Founding First Ladies and Slaves. At noon on the next two Wednesdays, May 24th and May 31st, we'll be showing two parts of the PBS documentary American Experience, JFK. First aired in November 2013, JFK weaves archival film and photographs with contemporary interviews to present a portrait of John F. Kennedy in honor of the centennial of his birth. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online. There are copies in the lobby, as well as a sign-up sheet where you can receive it in regular mail or by email. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities. There are applications for membership also in the lobby. And a little-known secret that I tell everyone: no one has ever been turned down for membership in the National Archives Foundation. Upstairs in the rotunda, the original Constitution of the United States, signed by the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, is on display. And every day of the week, thousands of people come to view it. Many of them bend down to examine the parchment through its glass protection, some trying to read the 18th century script. The Constitution is the foundation of our government, and it is the standard to which the Supreme Court of the United States looks when it decides the cases that come before it. The many Supreme Court case files, both appellate and original jurisdiction, are preserved here at the National Archives, as are opinions, docket books, minutes, attorney rolls, with our earliest records starting in 1790. We also have the audio recordings of the Supreme Court, and the majority have been digitized and available online. We're working on a project to prepare all of these digital recordings for our online catalog, and we hope to have them available by September of this year. Since its founding in 1934, the National Archives has also hosted Supreme Court justices in person, as well as in its records. And some of the justices we will discuss tonight have had close connections with this agency. In the 1950s, Justice Felix Frankfurter served on the board of the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, followed by Justice Brennan, Rehnquist, Blackmun, and Soter. In the 1960s, Justice Arthur Goldberg served on the Archivists Advisory Council. And starting in 2012, the National Archives launched a series of conversations with Supreme Court justices of the United States, including Associate Justices Stephen Breyer, Clarence Thomas, and Samuel Alito. Yale law professor and constitutional scholar Akhil Reed Amar leads these discussions, focusing on ideas, viewpoints, and issues related to the Constitution and their impact on the American people. And those are available on YouTube or Ustream. Now let's get to tonight's program so we can learn more about these Supreme Court justices. Please welcome to the podium Russell Smith, President of the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I am delighted on behalf of the Jewish Historical Society and the board members who are present tonight to thank the National Archives, especially Susan Clifton, for partnering with us for this annual program to commemorate Jewish American Heritage Month. We also want to thank the Supreme Court Historical Society and its staff for joining us in tonight's program. And a special thank you to Dr. Arnold Resnikoff, a longtime friend of the Jewish Historical Society, who first suggested that Dr. Dalin come to us as a speaker and helped us connect with both Dr. Dalin and Seth Waxman. What a pair for tonight. I want to welcome Frank Gilbert, a past president of the Jewish Historical Society, who is also the grandson of Justice Louis Brandeis. Thanks to Frank's generosity, the Society is fortunate to have in our collection Justice Brandeis's law school notebook and a beautiful oil portrait. As many of you may know, the Jewish Historical Society is planning a new Lillian and Albert Small Jewish Museum in Washington as part of the Capitol Crossing Development Project, which is a few blocks from here. Last November, our historic 1876 synagogue was cut from its base and moved for the second time in its life 50 feet into the middle of 3rd Street Northwest, where it's going to remain until the third and final move to the newly reopened corner of 3rd and F Streets Northwest, and there it will become the centerpiece of our brand new museum complex. Tonight's topic of Jewish Supreme Court justices is one that we plan to make a key element in the museum's exhibition and programming. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing our participants and thereby fulfilling the Society's mission of joining history, current events, and the promise of the future together to tell one of the many stories of Jewish Washington. Dr. David Dalin, historian and rabbi, is the author, co-author, or editor of 11 books, including Religion and State in the American Jewish Experience, co-authored with one of our prior panelists, Dr. Jonathan Sarna, and The Presidents of the United States and the Jews. His articles and book reviews have appeared in a variety of publications. Tonight, Dr. Dalin will talk about his just published book, which many of you have in your hands, Jewish Justices of the Supreme Court, From Brandeis to Kagan, which has already received excellent reviews since its release in April. In this first history of the 8 Jews who have served or currently serve on the U.S. Supreme Court, Dr. Dalin examines their lives and legal careers, as well as the changing role of Jews within the American legal profession. Dr. Dalin will be joined in conversation with Seth Waxman, who is himself a distinguished leader in the Washington and national legal communities. Mr. Waxman served as the 41st Solicitor General of the United States from 1997 until January 2001. After leaving government, Mr. Waxman taught both as a visiting fellow at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government and as a visiting professor at the Georgetown University Law Center. Mr. Waxman has argued 33 cases before the Supreme Court and has tried and argued dozens of other high-profile, complex civil and criminal cases in federal and state courts across the country. So now, I'm sure, after all that, you're ready, and I am too. It's my pleasure to invite Dr. Dalin and Seth Waxman to the stage. Gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Hi.
This is a pleasure.
Oh, it's so good to be here.
Enjoy.
Good evening. I'm Seth Waxman. This is the guest of honor and the author, David Dalin, Rabbi David Dalin. We couldn't hear any of the introduction because we were being held in a secure location.
Oh, good.
But the reviews are terrific. It's already trending on Twitter. Before we start, let me just say I think I will. I have about 4.5 hours worth of questions to ask you, David. But I'm going to limit myself to about 45 minutes, and then, assuming I can keep track of time, which I'm not very good at, open it up for audience questions, because I always find these things, people are here because they're interested, they have particular questions, and we have a great font of knowledge. I'm told that if you have a question, you should go to the aisles to the microphones, but I have to say that I don't see any microphones in the aisles.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
anyway, They will magically appear. So as you're thinking of questions and thinking about asking a question, once I open it up, in case I forget to tell you, please make your way to the mic, because this program is being broadcast, and in addition to the fact that either one or both of us won't be able to hear you, and your fellow attendees may not be able to hear, people in the television audience also would like to hear what your question is. So, and I also want to make sure, in case the previous speakers haven't already told you this, that there is a book signing immediately following the program, and the author himself will be available to answer questions and sign books for you. So welcome. So Professor Dalin and I met yesterday, and we immediately agreed on the convention that we would refer to each other by our first names. So David, let me just start by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself and your own sort of professional journey. I know that you're an ordained rabbi, and you're an author of many articles and books about American Jewish political history. How did you get to, what's your story before picking up the pen to write this book?
Well, Seth, it's a great question. I also want to thank you. I'm honored to have you as my interlocutor for this conversation. I am actually an ordained rabbi, but most of my work is as an American Jewish historian. And I have, my biggest field of interest is American Jewish political history and biography. And I've co-authored a book on the presidents of the United States and the Jews. And I've written major articles not only about Jews in the presidency, but the presidential appointment process and the various presidents who have appointed Jews to their cabinets and to other offices, and the relationship of this appointment process to the Jewish community. And through that, I became tremendously interested with the whole subject of Jewish appointees to the Supreme Court, and their relationship also to the presidents who appointed them, and also to their lives, legal careers, and Jewish personas as well. And many years ago, I became fascinated with Brandeis, Louis D. Brandeis, and of course I attended Brandeis University, as did my daughter, and I began reading biographies of Brandeis, and that led me into judicial biographies of several people, and I gravitated more and more to the Jewish justices. And after you read the several biographies of Brandeis, of Cardozo, of Frankfurter, even 2 or 3 of Abe Fortas, I thought it would be interesting. There had never been a book bringing it up to the present, and this book actually goes through the 2016 election. And so this is, as I think was said before, is not only the first history of the Jewish justices who have served in the past or who currently serve on the Supreme Court, but also a collective biography, as it were, of the Jewish men and women who have served on the court. And that's been an abiding interest for many, many years. And it finally, I finally decided it was a choice between 2 things. I've also written about Jews in baseball, which could be a future book, but I finally decided on the Jewish justices instead.
Well, I'll be very happy to come interview you about your forthcoming Jews in baseball.
That's a deal.
Jews in squash, Jews in polo, whatever it is that you choose to.
And those are 2 areas I hadn't even thought about. But,
Exactly.
And probably the Jews in squash will be a relatively small chapter, I would
Well,
guess.
the ball is small, but I mean, I think without doing the research as an historian, I'm sure
that's
you
true.
appreciate that there may be a lot of surprises
There
here,
would be.
right in the National Archives.
Right
about-
here, in fact, yes. In fact, God willing, if this book comes, I will come to the National Archives, because I know a lot about Jews in baseball, a little bit about Jews in basketball, but precious little about Jews in polo and squash. So this will be an incentive, and I will email you immediately as soon as I begin work on this.
Terrific, because I think I actually have some information I can provide you about
This is great. And
So, I have to say that, in talking to people about this event and people asking about the event, one question that I get, that I've gotten more frequently than I guess I would have anticipated, and this may be a generational thing because it is mainly from colleagues and professional friends who are significantly younger than I am. Just so that everybody puts this in context, I'm 65, so you can be significantly younger than I am and still have had a long, successful career in the law. But one recurring question that I've gotten, even from people in my generation, is, like, is there a reason to think about a group of justices as Jewish justices? I mean, and the answer, obviously, in your mind is yes.
Yes.
And so why don't you start by answering all those questions that I've gotten? Like, why write about Jewish justices? You know, is that a big deal?
Well, it is. I'll tell you why. Before Justice Brandeis was appointed in January of 1916, before that appointment, it was unimaginable that you would have a Jewish justice on the court. I want to come back to the question in a minute of anti-Semitism, the rise and then decline of anti-Semitism in the American legal profession. But so many things were different then. It would have truly been unimaginable in Brandeis's day that there would be not one, not two, but 3 Jews on the Supreme Court simultaneously, and even as much so that there would be a Supreme Court of 6 Catholic justices and 3 Jewish justices, and no Protestant on the court, which from 2010, when Elena Kagan succeeded John Paul Stevens, who was the last Protestant, till the appointment now of Neil Gorsuch, who's an Episcopalian, but this kind of thing would have been unimaginable. In the same era, you had, in the 2 decades that Brandeis was on the court, you had the emergence of what became a Catholic seat on the court. And then eventually a African-American seat on the court. And now there are 3 women on the court, and I think it's taken as axiomatic that there will continue to be at least 1 or 2 women on the court. Now this brings, if I can, the whole question of how this came about and anti-Semitism within the legal profession. Mm-hmm. And is it okay to address this, or with Brandeis, or?
Well, I'm going to ask you,
please.
You decide whether to address it now. It certainly is something I want you to talk about.
Sure.
I was thinking that, for those 2 or 3 people in the country who can't rattle off automatically who these, sometimes mysterious 8 Jewish justices are, maybe it would help to sort of, to set things off just by having you identify who they were, who they were nominated by, when they served, and just a couple sentences. I'm gonna, time permitting, ask you questions about each of them and what their, as your subtitle says, their legacy is. But I guess we may have to continue this discussion until tomorrow afternoon. But why don't you start off by saying, okay, we know Louis Brandeis was the first one. Tell us, let's go through the 8, particularly the ones who have now passed away, so that people in the audience understand the sort of landscape of what we're going to be talking about in addressing, among other things, the rise and fall of, or ascendancy and decline of anti-Semitism in the country and in the legal profession in particular.
Wonderful. Okay, Brandeis was appointed by Woodrow Wilson in January of 1916. It became a major issue of controversy in the Wilson administration. He was facing a very tough re-election battle the following November against Charles Evans Hughes, the former governor of New York, who actually resigned his Supreme Court seat to run against Wilson. And by the way, if anyone wants to know, there's stories that some are apocryphal and some not. Charles Evans Hughes went to sleep the night of the November 1916 election thinking that he had won the election, and Wilson assuming he had lost. And they both woke up to the change in realities. Now, the Brandeis nomination and Senate confirmation battle went on for 4 months. It was arguably the most contentious Senate confirmation battle until the battle over Robert Bork in 1987. And much of the controversy had to do, Brandeis was considered one of the leading progressive reformers. He had been Woodrow Wilson's main economic advisor since Wilson ran for election in 1912. And Wilson had hoped to appoint him Attorney General, but the avalanche of anti-Semitic opposition forestalled that. But Wilson remained committed to appointing him, and when he nominated him, he persevered and stood by him. Now, and later on, maybe we can talk about the actual opposition most of the opposition was anti-Semitic in nature, not because of his role as what was called the people's attorney. But and Wilson had one advantage, by the way, that President Obama did not have when he nominated Merrick Garland last year. By the way, some of you may know, or probably most of you know, that Merrick Garland would have been the 9th Jewish justice on the court. But Wilson had a Democratic Senate. And there were several progressive Republicans who crossed party lines, so to speak, to support Brandeis. So that all helped.
So let me just, this
Stop
is
with that.
fascinating, but I want to make sure that
We get to
in this introductory section,
Yes.
we get through all 8
Okay.
of them.
I'll try to
So
make them
let's
quicker.
just give us the real bare bones thumbnail sketch.
Real bare bones thumbnail
So he
sketch.
finally gets confirmed
He
in
finally gets
1916, and he
1916.
serves until when?
23 years until 1939. And he succeeded, well, first of all, Benjamin Cardozo was appointed with him in 1932 by Herbert Hoover. Now, all 7 of the 8 Jewish justices were appointed by Democratic presidents. But Hoover was, of course, the Republican president. And what's interesting is Cardozo was not only a lifelong Democrat, but it supported Al Smith against Hoover publicly in the 1928 presidential election. So Hoover transcended party allegiance, and just to conclude, Cardozo was considered the preeminent American jurist and judge not serving on the Supreme Court. And most historians and biographers, Hoover didn't have the greatest presidency in American history, and his appointment of Cardozo is considered one of his truly great achievements as president. So Cardozo dies. He had been ill when he came to Washington after 6 years in the court in 1938, and Brandeis
we're going to come back to this, but I'm correct, am I not, that for a brief period of time, Cardozo, in an era of anti-Semitism,
Yes.
Cardozo and Brandeis served on the Supreme Court together.
simultaneously for 6 years. And by the way, putting aside the other anti-Semitism, there was in that era a profoundly, viciously anti-Semitic justice, James McReynolds. Now, he had been outraged when Brandeis was appointed. In fact, there's a famous photo of the Supreme Court in 1924 that lacks one justice. McReynolds would not permit himself to be photographed near Brandeis. And when Hoover, from McReynolds' vantage point, had the audacity to appoint another Jew, he personally wrote a scathing letter to Hoover pleading with him not to afflict the court with another Hebrew. And when Brandeis retired in 1939, there's a tradition that the members of the court all sign it's like a retirement letter, which is framed for the retiring justice, and McReynolds refused to do so. So for 6 years, there were 2 Jews on the court. In 1939, when Cardozo retired, actually he had passed away, right after his retirement, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, appointed his old friend and advisor, Felix Frankfurter. And for 2 weeks, by the way, Frankfurter served on the court together with Brandeis before Brandeis officially retired. Frankfurter and, just briefly, Frankfurter and FDR had met at a lunch at New York's Harvard Club in 1906. They were both recent law school graduates from very, very different backgrounds, both very ambitious politically, and their connection and friendship continued on again, off again for 33 years until FDR's appointment of Frankfurter.
Okay.
Okay.
So we've got 3, so far by my count, we've come
3
up with
justices.
3, and we've had 1 anti-Jewish justice.
Right,
So
right.
we got McReynolds out of the way.
Yeah, and he retires in the 1940s with...
All right.
yeah.
I promise you we're coming back to all of these people except
Of
McReynolds.
course, of course.
But who's next?
Okay, next is...
So Frankfurter
okay.
passes away.
Frankfurter passes away in 1962. Oh, actually, he retires in 1962, passes away in 1965. He, interesting to note, all the Jewish justices were liberal justices by any definition. Frankfurter had been a flaming liberal Harvard law professor and attorney, but he became more and more conservative in his 23 years on the court. And when he resigned in 1962, he was the most conservative member of the Warren Court, and he became a prophet or advocate of judicial restraint. Anyway, John F. Kennedy then appoints Arthur Goldberg to succeed Frankfurter on the court. Now, Arthur Goldberg is the only one of the 8 Jewish justices to have served in the cabinet before. He was probably the best-known lawyer and labor negotiator in the country. He had negotiated the merger of the AFL-CIO, and President Kennedy appointed him Secretary of Labor. And he served the shortest tenure, less than 3 years on the court. And if you because
we're going to come back to this for sure, I promise.
To LBJ persuaded him to leave a lifetime position, and he lived until 1991, to accept a position given at the pleasure of the president, ambassador to the United Nations, during which time he had a falling out with LBJ, and he was out of the UN in 2.5 years.
All right, so he's out, and who's in?
He's in, okay, Abe Fortas, LBJ's closest political advisor for many years, and if I could the genesis of their friendship, if I could do it in a minute or two.
Are we going to talk about Landslide Lyndon?
Landslide Lyndon.
Okay.
This is great. This is a great story. 1948, Fortas and Lyndon Johnson had met in the New Deal. Fortas was a New Deal lawyer who, by the way, we'll come back to, first in his class at Yale Law School, couldn't get a job in a major law firm because he was Jewish. He worked in the New Deal. He got to know a young congressman from Texas, Lyndon Johnson. 1948, in the election, the fight of his lifetime, Johnson gave up a safe congressional seat to run for the Senate from Texas. Had he lost that race, we never would have heard of Lyndon Johnson. In an amazingly close race.
Are we sure he didn't lose that race?
Well, I'll come back to that. In my book, I document the fact that, well, there's a good argument that he did lose that race, for that you'll have to read the book. Now, it was such a close race after 1,560,000 votes cast, or thereabouts, it was sent to a blue ribbon committee of Washington attorneys to investigate and check about whether there was voter fraud. And well, we know there was a great deal of voter fraud. The person who had chaired this committee and who argued the case at the Supreme Court in favor of Lyndon Johnson was a young up-and-coming attorney by the name of Abe Fortas. And Johnson never forgot this. Throughout his years as majority leader of the Senate in the 1950s and as vice president, Abe Fortas was his closest advisor. He and his wife, Lady Bird, socialized with Abe Fortas and his wife, and he always wanted to offer Fortas to, reciprocate and do something for his friend Abe. And despite the fact that Abe Fortas didn't want to, he turned down an offer to be Attorney General, and then his wife helped him turn down, which is a great story in the book, that, and also Johnson's nudging him and pressuring him to go on the court. The only way he could do that was to take Arthur Goldberg off the court. So he decided there was then a tradition of the Jewish seat on the court, which if we want, we'll talk about. So he basically, on the way, invites Fortas to a meeting about something else, actually Vietnam policy, and he invites him to go out to the Rose Garden where he wants to just make some announcements, a press conference. On the way over there, much to Fortas's anger and surprise, he tells him that he's announcing his nomination to the Supreme Court. And by the way, Arthur Goldberg had not yet officially accepted his invitation to the UN. So, and basically, we can come back to it, he had to take a 90% salary cut. In the 1950s, he and his wife, who were partners in the major law firm that bore then Fortas's name, drove twin Rolls Royces. They had a combined income in the 1950s of $400,000. His wife, who you'll learn about more in the book, was a piece of work, had 150 pairs of shoes in one closet. And they loved
So
to...
can I just,
Yes,
this is all
stop
really
there.
interesting, but unless I'm wrong, Abe Fortas actually didn't serve very long on the
No.
Supreme Court, and in any event, we seem to be sort of stuck on the fifth
We
justice.
want to go in the
So,
future.
Yeah,
Okay.
I have a whole, book of questions to ask you, so
and
I just
also
want you to
tomorrow-
list off the other ones.
And tomorrow afternoon, I've got a flight to catch, so I
Okay.
can't stay till... But, you know, okay. So anyway, we'll talk about afterwards in what became the biggest scandal of a Jewish justice. Abe Fortas eventually resigned the court in 1969. And by the way, he served a few months longer than Arthur Goldberg. And in that case, Richard Nixon appointed Harry Blackmun to the court. So it was a Protestant, which ended the tradition of a so-called Jewish seat. Now, it would take 24 years before another Jew would be appointed to the court. In the interim, I'm trying to think who Reagan nominated.
Many people.
Yeah, many people. Yes, many people. But after Robert Bork, another Ginsburg, Douglas Ginsburg, who had to withdraw his candidacy when it was revealed that he had smoked marijuana not only while a law student, but also while a law professor at Harvard. Anyway.
Shocking no one,
Shocking
but
no-
scandalizing the
The
political
Reagans,
establishment.
especially, and the Reagan family and Reagan's advisors. So you wait a few more years. In 1994, Bill Clinton appoints Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the court. And a year later, Stephen Breyer to the court. Not only, these were the only Supreme Court appointments that Bill Clinton had. He appointed two Jews, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, none of these, they and Elena Kagan thereafter, did not confront any anti-Semitism, either on their ascents in their legal careers to the court, or their religion was almost not mentioned in the hearings at all, the confirmation hearings. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who we can talk about later, did face a lot of obstacles being a woman in a legal profession that was still predominantly male. When she entered Harvard Law School in 1956, she was only one of 9 students in a class of over 500, and there's a lot to talk about here, but I won't get carried away now. She became, of course, the first, the second woman after Sandra Day O'Connor, and the first Jewish woman on the court. Now, a year later, Stephen Breyer, who I'm proud to say is a fellow landsman from San Francisco, the only San Francisco Jew, is a proud San Franciscan to be on the court. I think the only San Franciscan, because technically Earl Warren didn't live in San Francisco. But anyway, and he is appointed, and both of them still serve on the court today. They're considered pretty much part of the liberal bloc on the court. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who just turned 84, has now surpassed Brandeis and Frankfurter by a few months in terms of longevity of Jewish justices on the court. Stephen Breyer had a very interesting, I'll talk about other things, but just to say that he served in the 1980s on leave from Harvard Law School as the chief counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Both he and Ruth Bader Ginsburg were known as voices for, conviviality on the court. He got along with everyone. As counsel for the Judiciary Committee, he was able to get along famously with the late Ted Kennedy on the one hand, the leading Democrat, and Orrin Hatch on the other hand. Kennedy and Orrin Hatch agreed on not many things. They also were close personal friends, but they agreed on their admiration and respect for Steve Breyer. When he was nominated in the last days of Jimmy Carter's administration to the federal bench, they came together to finesse his nomination. And then 14 years later, And as many people said, anyone who could get along so wonderfully and so closely with both Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy must have been doing something right.
Okay, so drum roll, please, to Elena Kagan,
Okay.
so we get through the introductory
We do.
portion.
Okay, and Elena Kagan, who was a graduate of Princeton University and Harvard Law School, was also a Marshall Scholar at Oxford University, as was Stephen Breyer, started out working in the Clinton administration on the domestic policy staff. She then became the first woman dean and the first Jewish woman dean of Harvard Law School. And then she followed in the distinguished steps.
I guess if she was the first woman dean,
She would also be the
probably
first.
would also qualify.
Yeah,
as the
that was a
first
little
Jewish-
redundant
yeah.
on my part. But I was just going to say she followed in the great steps of my interlocutor here. She became the next Jewish Solicitor General in 2009, and in this case, the first woman Solicitor General, and I guess the fourth Jewish Solicitor General, you told me. And then a year later, President Obama appointed her to the Supreme Court. And by the way, one of the efforts of presidents when they appoint justices is to appoint hopefully younger justices who with good health may serve 30 years. She was the exact same age, 49, going on a few months to 50, as Neil Gorsuch was now. But that's
the golden era to get nominated.
that's right. In your
current
late
era.
That's right. That's right. But now I think I've exhausted the litany, except of course if we have time about Merrick Garland, who did not quite make it to the court.
Well, I mean, we're talking about legacies and history here, and I think you'll agree as an historian that it is perhaps a little premature to talk about the legacies of the sitting justices.
I think you're
so
right.
while I do have some questions for you about the sitting justices, they are in the process of writing their own legacies, and I'm going to focus a lot of in my remaining 20 minutes before opening it up to the audience.
Oh, gosh.
I guess that gives me about 17 minutes to get to my concluding remarks.
I'll try to keep my remarks short.
Look, I want to ask you some things about some of these justices in particular and have you share with the audience some of your learning about them. But I need to have you, when we talk about these people as Jewish justices, we are using the convention here that they were born to Jewish mothers.
Yes.
Correct?
That's all correct.
To what extent are we talking about people for whom Jewish observance, Jewish spirituality, and Jewish belief appeared to you to be a significant aspect of their lives up to the time that they served on the court and while they were serving on the court? Because when, they're Jewish because they had a Jewish mother, but I think a lot of people want to know, this is a lead up to the question of to what extent their Jewish faith, their Jewish beliefs, their cultural Judaism may or may not have affected or influenced who they were as people and how they performed as judges. So,
with the singular exceptions of Justice Cardozo, who came from a very religious Sephardic family, and Justice Goldberg, who was very active Jewishly in the Jewish community, and by the way, had an annual Passover Seder here that was the talk of Washington.
Which was really fair to say was more like a labor movement revival meeting than a Seder. Right?
It was indeed. In fact, a perennial guest at the Seder was George Meany, the labor leader who used to...
George Meany.
Pardon me?
Rav George Meany.
George Meany, who regaled the Seder dinner and audience with Irish songs, with Irish folk songs. And by the way, Goldberg's wife Dorothy regaled with Yiddish songs. But I'll come back because later on one very interesting anecdote to Goldberg, but your question is well taken. There was not, most of the Jewish justices were not really practicing religious Jews. And starting with Brandeis, it's interesting. He came from a family, he grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. His parents were German-speaking Jews from Prague. He was raised almost as a Christian, although both of his parents were Jewish. His mother was said to, admire the ethics of all religions and the rituals and observances of none. And in their home, they never celebrated the Jewish Sabbath or Christmas, and Hanukkah rather, but Christmas. And in Brandeis continued in this tradition. And if I could tell just two very short but quick anecdotes as an example, hopefully short.
We don't want to give away the whole book. But
yeah, maybe I'll tell you one of them rather than two, but two shorts. Okay, Brandeis was a prolific letter writer. There are many volumes of his letters. In 1900, his two young daughters were on vacation in the days before Christmas in New York visiting relatives. Brandeis wrote a letter to them saying, "Please don't worry. The Christmas tree is set up and Santa Claus will be here to greet you." The other thing which I always find is fascinating is he was very close to his brother Alfred, who remained in Louisville. Now, every month or 6 weeks, his cousin Alfred would send them a ham from Louisville. Now, my question was, there were no hams in Boston? But there would be these wonderful notes from Brandeis saying, "Thank you, we're overjoyed. The Brandeis household is overjoyed here. We just received your ham today," etc. Now, he also...
I want to come back after we get done with the Yiddishkeit of all of the justices, or at least the non-sitting justices. I want to get back to Zionism, and there's a very interesting story here.
Yeah.
So
Zionism.
No, Cardozo.
Oh, Cardozo. Okay. Cardozo is descendant from one of probably the preeminent Sephardic Jewish family in America. He was a direct descendant of Gershon Mendes Seixas, who may not ring a bell for most of you, but he was the only rabbi officiating at George Washington's giving an invocation. There were 14 clergy at his inauguration in 1790. Mendes Seixas had been the first Jew ever appointed to the Board of Governors of Columbia University at the recommendation of Alexander Hamilton, and not until Benjamin Cardozo would another Jew be appointed to this. One of his cousins was the deputy mayor of New York. Emma Lazarus was a first cousin, etc.
So we know, this is an appropriate term for a Sephardic Jew, but I don't know what this, so we know about his yichus.
His yichus.
But what about his
Jewishness?
His beliefs, his practices?
Well, he too, he belonged to what's called the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York, Shereth Israel, which is the oldest continuing synagogue in the United States. He belonged meant that he kept a ticket, and when he was in New York, he occasionally went on the high holidays. He always kept it. There was a seat that in his honor. He very rarely attended services there. He was bar mitzvah there, but he, for the most part, unlike Brandeis, who served, I would say, glut treif food always. Cardozo would never serve pork or shellfish in his home. And by the way, he was a little taken aback when, on his first invitation to the Brandeis home when he came to Washington, that's what Brandeis served him. But
fair to say that didn't augur well for a close relationship between the two on the court.
And I think that's an understatement, yes. On the court or off the court. But he remained always affiliated. When he died, the memorial service was at the Shereth Israel of Spanish-Portuguese. He remained I guess one could call it a non-practicing Orthodox Jew. If and when he went to a synagogue, it had to be an Orthodox synagogue. And his closest friend in the world was Irving Lehman of Lehman Brothers, the older brother of Herbert Lehman, the governor and senator from New York. And when Cardozo died, he died at the Lehman's mansion, and they took care of him, he and his wife Sally, in his last weeks. They were so shocked when they went they had the funeral at Shereth Israel, because one of Cardozo's other closest friends was Stephen S. Wise, one of the great Zionist leaders in America, and one of the preeminent rabbis in America. But Stephen Wise was a Reform rabbi, and the leaders of Shereth Israel would not permit him to officiate in any way or even to give a eulogy. And that shocked Irving Lehman, who was a very committed Reform Jew, the president of Temple Emmanuel, and even his close friends didn't realize that how orthodox a Jew he really was or was not, because he never practiced his Orthodox Judaism.
Okay, so Felix Frankfurter,
This is interesting.
born in the old country,
Born in the old country.
comes to the United States at age 12 not knowing one word of English,
Correct.
bar mitzvahed,
Bar mitzvah
goes to a yeshiva,
for a while.
yep, in Bed-Stuy because they
Yep.
thought it was the best, safest school for him.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, then what happened?
Okay, at the age of 15, he decides Judaism is not for him. He becomes a self-proclaimed agnostic. He goes to City College and then in Harvard Law School, where he's at the top of his class. By the way, I have the first published photograph of him in his Harvard Law School dorm in the book. But he wanted very much to become part of the Protestant elite in the country. He married the daughter of a Protestant minister. His mother, incidentally, did not attend the wedding. He never set foot in a temple or synagogue in his adult life except to give an occasional lecture. But here's the paradox. In his will, to the surprise and shock even of his Protestant wife and most of his friends, he asked that the Kaddish, the traditional Jewish prayer of mourning, be recited at his funeral. Now, he specified Louis Henkin. Louis Henkin was one of his favorite law clerks, was not only a practicing Orthodox Jew, but the son of one of the preeminent Orthodox rabbis in America. Frankfurter, the agnostic, admired Henkin.
And a preeminent legal scholar
And a
until his
preeminent
death.
legal scholar who for 40 years was a law professor at Columbia University. And you may know better, I think one of the great authorities on international law.
Correct.
He at one point had been a consultant to the State Department. And Frankfurter remained close to him. In fact, he always said he was his one friend who was a practicing Orthodox Jew.
So Frankfurter, very Jewish till 15.
Yeah.
Casts it all off, becomes Jewish again in
At
his funeral.
And he says to another friend, shortly before his death, he says, well, I was born Jewish. Most of my life, I did not live as a Jew, but I want to die as a Jew.
Okay. So much for Jewish influence during his 23 years on the court.
Correct.
Okay, so we're up to
we are up to
Justice Goldberg,
Justice Goldberg,
did belong to a synagogue
Yes.
his whole life. What else?
Okay, he was an early Zionist. We'll come back to it. In fact, he and his wife were close friends of Golda Meir, later Golda Meir. They were in Chicago. She was in Milwaukee as teenagers in the Zionist movement. He grew up in Chicago, was at the first in his class at Northwestern University, couldn't get a job in one of the big law firms, but got a job in what was then a small Jewish law firm that founded by the two Pritzker brothers. Now, if this name sounds familiar, they're the Pritzker family that eventually started and still owns the Hyatt hotel chain.
Can we just get back to the spirituality?
Oh, the spirituality, yes. Let's stack up, and I'm going to take my watch out to remind me. Okay, the spirituality was interesting. He was a much more Jewish Jew than any of the other justices.
Sounds like it wasn't saying very much.
It wasn't saying very much, truly. I'll give you one example and then one great anecdote. When he used to have, he didn't keep kosher, the dietary laws, but when he'd sponsor these great seders, he would insist if any of his law clerks observed kashrut, he would all make them strictly kosher. And one of the years, Alan Dershowitz, who many of you know of, who was then a strictly Orthodox Jew. So for this, he had the best kosher caterer in Washington, cater a very expensive kosher seder. And by the way, on his Supreme Court letterhead, he wrote out the Goldberg family recipe for charosas, the traditional Passover dish, which was sent to the kosher caterer, a copy of which is one of the photos in my book. But spiritually, he was a Jewish Jew. and as was his wife. And I wanted, if one quick anecdote, cute anecdote, that it'll be very quick, I hope. That
we're not. It's 5 minutes to 8, and we're not even up to Fortas yet.
Oh yeah,
just
so this
on Yiddishkeit.
Just on Yiddishkeit. Okay, he always told the story of visiting while he was Secretary of Labor, his elderly Jewish mother in Chicago. And while he was oversleeping one day and just kind of half awake, the phone rings and his mother asks, "Who is this?" And it's President Kennedy. So he answers, "The president." So she says, "The president knew of which shul?"
Okay, just a word or two about the Yiddishkeit of Justice Fortas, and then I'm going to ask you to reflect again on my question of, so why are we talking about Jewish justices? The extent, if any, to which, and I know you're not a lawyer or a legal scholar, in your research you were able to discern any impact on the jurisprudence of these people of the fact that they were at least born Jewish.
Okay. First,
So
a bit about
first Fortas.
Fortas. Okay, Fortas, like Frankfurter, was born into an Orthodox family. He grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. He also pretty much cut his ties with Orthodoxy in high school and continued to be really indifferent to anything in Jewish religious practice or tradition. His wife was not Jewish, and she was not particularly interested in Judaism at all, and she continued in this, pushed him in that direction. He was the first in his class at Yale Law School. By the way, the same legend has it that while Brandeis was first in his class scholastically at Harvard, a scholastic average that's never been met since, they said the same thing about Fortas. Fortas's mentor was William Douglas, who later was on the court. He also couldn't get a job in a law firm, in a big city blue chip law firm, blue shoe law firm, so he went to work in the New Deal. And of course, as I said before, that's when he meets LBJ. He eventually forms a new law firm in Washington. What is the first name?
Arnold Fortas and Porter.
Arnold Fortas and Porter, which is today Arnold and Porter, which I make mention about at the end. Okay, his wife eventually, who's a tax specialist, becomes a partner of the same firm. They have a combined salary in the middle 1950s of over $400,000. He would have to take a 90% salary thing to join the court. They drove.
So was he going to shul?
Never. Okay. Never go to shul. And his wife discouraged him tremendously in that area. Although when he visited, they never had children, his Jewish nephews and nieces in Memphis, he talked to them. They told him about what it was like to live a Jewish life, which he knew very little about. Except for one thing, he was very pro-Israel. His closest friend in Washington for many years was Avram Harman, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States, later president of the Hebrew University.
Some of his best friends were Jewish.
Some of his best friends were Jewish. I should have put that in the book.
Maybe the answer to this question is obvious, since the justices that we've talked about so far, that none of them, either they had no Jewish upbringing, as in the case of Louis Brandeis, or they had a Jewish upbringing which they forsook, largely in the case of the others. I wouldn't say that it's probably not fair to say about Cardozo. He just became indifferent and inobservant. But unlike, Frankfurter or Fortas, which was just a categorical rejection. This is a disability of my birth that I'm going to try to overcome.
In fact, Frankfurter actually said it was an accident of birth.
Is it fair to say that it's hard to discern an effect of their Judaism on their jurisprudence?
I think it is fair to say. By the way, with one very quick caveat, because I know Mr. Gilbert, who's the grandson of Justice Brandeis, is here, when his parents, I guess, when they had children, and when Justice Brandeis in the late 20s and 30s had Jewish grandchildren, then he began to write cards to them for Rosh Hashanah and for Hanukkah. And that was a Jewish influence late in life. But no, I think it's fair to say that their Judaism had very little, if anything, impact on their jurisprudence, on their judicial opinions, even in the case of Cardozo. And the one thing it did do, which is a legacy of both Brandeis and Frankfurter, for the first time they appointed Jewish law clerks. And that became something, it wasn't out of religiosity, and some of the law clerks were much more religious. But I think it's fair to say, with possibly one exception, that with Frankfurter, that it was negative, actually, that their Jewishness or Jewish background had no effect on their jurisprudence. So one other exception, Goldberg, on church-state issues. Goldberg's Jewish background did have some influence on his opinions.
So I think a couple things more about Justice Brandeis.
Yeah.
You talk about this in your book, but Justice Brandeis had an uncle,
Yes.
with whom he was very close,
Yeah.
close enough to take his
Middle name.
Yeah. Who was very, very observant.
Right.
And do you want to talk about that just
Sure.
a little bit?
His uncle's name was Louis Dembitz, and Brandeis eventually changed his middle name from David to Dembitz in honor of his uncle. His uncle in Louisville was one of the leaders of the Orthodox Jewish community. He was a Jewish scholar who actually published a couple of books on the Bible with the Jewish Publication Society. He was an Orthodox Jew. Brandeis recalled in his letters very memorably the only exposure to traditional Shabbat dinners on a Friday night or Saturday would be at his uncle's home. But he didn't emulate his uncle in this way. It was his uncle who inspired him to pursue a career in the law. Now, his uncle also was a fervent abolitionist, and this is interesting. His uncle named two of his sons Abraham Lincoln Dembitz and Henry Clay Dembitz. Now, also, his uncle was one of the founders of the Republican Party, that's the party of Lincoln and the abolitionists, in Kentucky, and was one of the three people who put Lincoln's name in nomination at the 1860 Republican Convention. But there was a very great closeness between the two, and it was his uncle's legal scholarship also that inspired Brandeis, but his religiosity and his religious practice did not. And he somehow separated the two.
So on the, let's turn, now for a few minutes to Zionism, because, any biography of
Right.
Zionism is an important theme, I think, with the justices that we've been talking about.
Sure.
And, none more than Louis Brandeis,
Yeah.
who, of course, was the president of the American Jewish Zionist
Yeah,
movement.
what today is the
and,
Zionist Organization of America, yeah.
and your book, recounts, at one point actually contemplated resigning his Supreme Court seat in order to assume leadership of the World Zionist
And
Organization.
especially, this is the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration this November, and he worked so assiduously on the court, by the way, which wasn't really, it was an extrajudicial, which I don't know if we'll have time to talk about, activity, pushing and persuading Woodrow Wilson and the Wilson administration to support the Balfour Declaration.
So how do you explain the fact that we have somebody who was raised in a terribly, not terribly, a resolutely secular family in Kentucky,
Yeah.
the son of, a descendant of the German Jewish immigration.
Right.
Living in a community, very unlike the sort of shtetl existence that Frankfurter came out of and moved into in Bedford-Stuyvesant and the Lower East Side. when does he, quote, discover Zionism, and what does Zionism have to do with Louis Brandeis's
It's amazing.
persona and beliefs?
He's the first 50 years of his life, he had no Jewish connection at all. He lived in areas that there were no Jewish neighbors. He had one or two Jewish friends. The genesis of this, which I talk a lot about in my book, was he was invited in to be one of the negotiators at the garment workers' strike in New York in 1910. For the first time in his life, he met East European Jews, and he found an affinity with them. It's just, which he talks about. These were Jews. His other Jewish friends had always been very assimilated German Jews. And all of a sudden, he somehow, it struck a chord with him. And these were Yiddish-speaking Jews. Of course, he knew no Yiddish. And he became interested from that experience in Zionism. And some of the people he mentioned there, Henry Moskowitz, who later played a role in the Senate confirmation battles, who was a leading political figure in New York at the time, and others who came from more traditional backgrounds. And Jacob de Haas, who had been Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, first basically representative in the United States, they told him more and more about Zionism. They also told him more and more that he didn't know about his uncle Dembitz, who was a profound Zionist leader and an early Zionist leader. So, and as time went on, he was Jewishly almost illiterate. He began to read more and more about Judaism, and he began to find a tremendous link between Zionism and Americanism, and that was the key for him. And I just wish I knew the exact phrase, but his famous phrase at one point was that to be to be a better American.
I can remember the phrase.
You can remember this. Please clue me in on this.
Right. To be a great American, you first have to be a great Jew, and
Yeah.
to be a great Jew, you first have to be a Zionist.
Exactly. And that became,
Which is a perplexing
yes,
set of
to say the least.
propositions.
It is, and
And
thank you
probably
for
amazing to the vast majority
Yeah.
of Americans who not only don't feel that they need to be a great
Right.
Jew to be a great American, but don't have the tools to
Yeah.
become a great Jew in any event.
in any event, and like he didn't before, and it created a lot of tension because so many Jewish leaders didn't feel the same way. But once he became involved, it became his passion. He also he brought some wealthy Jewish friends, German Jews like Eugene Meyer, who the financier and the founder of the Washington Post, the Washington Post family, and Abraham Filene's Basement, and others. He brought them into the Zionist movement. Also Felix Frankfurter, and to an extent Benjamin Cardozo. And by the way, it should be noted, a footnote, Benjamin Cardozo officiated at Felix Frankfurter's wedding, which is just a nice thing to know about. But Brandeis was a charismatic speaker, and and close to Woodrow Wilson, he barnstormed the country in support of Zionism, and he made Zionism respectable amongst Christians as well as Jews. In fact, I must just tell you one.
Okay, I'm going to give you the hook because I need to ask you one thing. I need to ask you to tell us one thing about Frankfurter, and I'm giving myself the hook in 2 minutes. So people in the audience, get ready with your questions.
Well, several.
I can pass around all of the unasked questions that I have if anybody flags, but. Frankfurter, let me just to summarize my understanding of it. So while Frankfurter in many ways was a protege of Brandeis, very, very different as a personality, very, very different in background, but was actually, for many, many years, actually paid by Brandeis to write and publish as a very progressive public intellectual, and deputized by Brandeis to get involved and promote the Zionist movement. And the book recounts a fascinating story in which Frankfurter negotiates a letter from the then king of Saudi Arabia
Yeah.
saying that, Arabs favor the Balfour Declaration and favor the creation of a Jewish homeland, for which Frankfurter took an outsized amount of credit.
And,
For whatever value it has. But
yeah.
is it fair to say that Frankfurter's devotion to Zionism was more in the nature of an assignment?
Yes, very much so.
Okay, I'd like you to, Frankfurter was, both Brandeis and Frankfurter, and Fortas for that matter, and Goldberg were, your book recounts beautifully how unbelievably tied in they were to the administrations of the presidents that appointed them, and probably no one more profoundly and integrally as Felix Frankfurter. I mean, given the long scope of FDR's tenure.
Sure.
I mean, you can say that probably nobody more profoundly than Abe Fortas, who seemed to spend more time in the White House and in the National Security Council
And
than
by the
actually
way,
in the
yeah,
Supreme Court, to the
right.
point that his law clerks felt free
Yeah.
to take naps
That's
in the
right.
Supreme Court because they were sure he wasn't going to show up.
And by the way, something I didn't know before this, actually it was Abe Fortas who drafted LBJ's 1966 State of the Union address.
Okay, but I want, and so, I mean, there's no reason to think that, is there, that Felix Frankfurter had an overwhelming degree of influence, both over FDR and over Frankfurter's own many proteges in the administration. I'd just like, before we open it up to questions, I'd like you to recount for us the episode you describe in connection with the Holocaust of Jan Karski. Okay. And Jan Karski, who he was, what he discovered, and what he did with it in Washington, particularly with respect to Frankfurter, because this is something I did not know and I find amazing.
Well, yeah, no, certainly, Seth. Jan Karski, some of you may know of, because I think taught for many years at Georgetown in his later years. Jan Karski was the representative of the Polish government in exile. He had been, he had gotten into the Auschwitz death camp and realized in secret what was being done there. He then became the emissary to tell the Western world what was happening in the Holocaust. And he comes to the United States at the end of 1942, and with a report that he wrote, but also his firsthand account of what was happening in the final solution. Now, first, he is told Frankfurter is a very close friend of the Polish ambassador to the United States. So he tells Jan Karski, you have to meet with Justice Frankfurter, who was, of course, Jewish. So Jan Karski tells him in documented detail about the horrors that he's witnessed firsthand and about the Nazis' war against the Jews. And after speaking for close to a half an hour, Frankfurter gets up, he was always very formal, and says, "Sir, I cannot believe what you're saying." And Jan Karski says, "Well, Mr. Justice, I wouldn't lie to you. I wouldn't." And he said, no, you misunderstand me. He said, "I cannot believe that in this 20th century, that something as horrible as you're saying is actually taking place. He then turns his back on Karski and walks out. Karski then and the Polish ambassador asked him to set up a meeting with FDR to convey this. Frankfurter basically meets with FDR before and tells him that, well, he himself cannot believe that something like this is taking place. Now, what's incredible about this, Frankfurter never lobbies FDR. One might have been expected that Frankfurter, who used to lobby the president on a whole host of issues, including appointing some of his students to federal judgeships. In fact, he had a several-year-long campaign to appoint Learned Hand to the Supreme Court. He used to call FDR at night even. When it came to the Holocaust, he did nothing. In fact, he had an elderly uncle who was his favorite uncle, Solomon Frankfurter, was arrested by the Nazi police in Austria, in Vienna and was held in his 80s, was held a prisoner for several days. One would have expected then Frankfurter to go to the president and say, please do something to help my uncle, my favorite uncle. He didn't. Instead, he went through an interesting connection, even more shocking, with Lady Astor in England, who he knew as a friend, but asking him. So and one last thing, he was a protege of Henry Stimson, who was then the Secretary of, was it War or State? Was War, okay. His neighbor and close friend was John McCloy, the Deputy Secretary of War. He walked to work with John McCloy almost every day. John McCloy was the War Department official responsible for vetoing a War Department proposal to bomb Auschwitz, the death camp, and the railroads to him. He would see McCoy every day and talk to him. He never tried to persuade McCoy to change that.
And this was at a point, this was, if I'm correct, this was at a point in time in which Allied bombers were bombing the industrial sections of Auschwitz. Precisely.
Within 5 minutes of Auschwitz.
But
actually the industrial section of Auschwitz itself, it would have, this was in late 1944, when there was still 750 Hungarian Jews who were to be deported to Auschwitz until in the months before the end of the war. Had they bombed even the railroads to Auschwitz, not the death camp, it would have slowed up the Nazi process of murder by many, many months. But McCloy successfully vetoed this, and Felix Frankfurter, as far as we know, never did a thing to try to dissuade him or his good friend, Henry Stimson.
Okay, we're throwing it open to the audience, and we have a member of the audience who's been sitting patiently by the assigned microphone. So, sir, if you could just identify yourself and let us know what your question is.
I'm Rashad Thomas. I have like two questions. So my first question is, did any of the justices encounter anti-Semitism after they became Supreme Court justices, number one? And number two, is there something distinctive about their Jewishness that contributed to, by and large, their liberalism? I think most of the justices who have been Jews on the court are left of center in their philosophy. So does their Jewishness play a role in that?
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, the first question first, which is easy. Only Brandeis and Cardozo, the anti-Semitism they faced while on the court was from that Justice McReynolds, who was a vocal anti-Semite. But not once they were secure on the court, they didn't face it. They were all liberals, even Frankfurter when he started out, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg has written about this, attributing her support for social justice and for so many liberal social and economic issues to her Jewish background and to the Judaism that she inculcated. In this article, she said that me and so many of my colleagues are descended from rabbis, and we've inculcated this. The problem with, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg is an exception, she's been more Jewishly involved. Many of the Jewish justices, for example, like Brandeis, and let's say Brandeis and Frankfurter even, in his early days, didn't know enough about Judaism to realize that their predisposition for social justice and for helping the poor, etc., was coming from a tradition that they really didn't understand. So but they were all nominated by liberal democratic presidents, with the exception of Cardozo. But most people have attributed, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg has written about this, that their liberalism came from almost their DNA, that they were all, descended, not all, but most of them were descended from very strongly religious families. And by the way, a footnote on Ruth Bader Ginsburg, at the age of 15, I have a photo in the book, she was the camp rabbi at her, and she was known as that, at her summer camp in the Adirondacks.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your words today. I am a college student here in the Washington, D.C. area.
What's your name?
My name is Nathan Weissler.
Okay, Nathan, hi.
I've been deeply interested in Jewish history for several years, actually since I was in elementary school, and your book is one of the most meaningful books that I've read in a long time. I've read it cover to cover.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. My question is, throughout your research, what did you find most interesting about learning about Justice Goldberg's efforts to and advocacy for ending the death penalty, and what do you think?
That's interesting. And that may be derivative of his Jewish background. Arthur Goldberg, with the assistance of Alan Dershowitz, his law clerk at the time, where he went on a campaign. He tried to get a campaign going to render the death penalty unconstitutional. The problem was, had he not resigned from the court, when he did, he might have achieved this himself. By the time the first death penalty cases came out, and some of them were, there was really attacking the constitutionality of the death penalty. Constitutionality, it was in the 1970s when he had been off the court. But he and Alan Dershowitz, and I cite in my book, wrote a famous Harvard Law Review article in 1969 about rendering the death penalty unconstitutional. And that, I would say, was one area where and he was probably still the most knowledgeable in terms of Jewish religious tradition. That came, I think, from his understanding of what then was not called tikkun olam, and of Jewish values.
Thank you. Sir?
My name is Shelley Gilman. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. I beg to disagree with you slightly. Louis Brandeis, his entire family lived within walking distance of Congregation Knesset Israel, Anshe Sfard, Adish Ashurin, and the entire Jewish community lived in a central area of Louisville, which was very open at that time to German Jews and especially Polish Jews. Now, turning to your, I'd like to present a slightly different perspective on this, Rabbi. When I study the Talmud, and I perceive the obligations of a Jew to the treatment of employees, to the treatment of the relationships of other people, and I read the decisions of Justice Brandeis as to how you treat your employees. And then when I look at Justice Cardozo, not necessarily when he was on the Supreme Court, but when I looked at his decisions on the Court of Appeals of New York, and I see the Salmon versus Myman case, of the punctilious requirement of honor among partners and the relationship of partners. And then I see the Falsgraf case of proximate cause. What do these things result from? These all stem from Talmudic lessons of how we have contractual relations, commercial relationships. So I can draw a relationship to the understanding of Jewish law to our civil law. Your comment, Rabbi.
Okay, I think there definitely is a relationship in the case of Cardozo, who did, although he wasn't a practicing Orthodox Jew, but did inculcate a great, significant understanding of Jewish tradition, Talmudic precedents, and Talmudic tradition. Brandeis really didn't have that kind of Jewish knowledge or Jewish education. Now, he later became very interested in Judaism, but I'm not sure if one can draw a connection between his decisions in those areas and maybe they had been inculcated subconsciously, but he did not have the knowledge or understanding of Jewish teachings, rabbinic teachings, and biblical teachings that, for example, Cardozo did. Although Cardozo didn't set foot in the synagogue on a regular basis, he had the Jewish knowledge. So that would be the only thing and that I would say. But Brandeis did, you're right, on those decisions, and because he was a progressive reformer also. and he was one of the leading, progressive voices in America at that point.
And Brandeis' name stays alive with the University of Louisville's law school.
Yes.
The Louis Brandeis Law School.
Which is a wonderful, it really is, yeah. And that was changed, I guess, just in the past 20 or 30 years.
Okay. Take a
Rabbi
question
Dalin?
we had
Yeah.
one from the left, now we get one from the right.
Rabbi Dalin, yes, my name is Jonathan Golub. I'm a class of 1985, Brandeis University as well. So I guess we're Landsmen in a different way.
Yes, yes.
But actually, I'm on my way after this venue to another venue less than a mile away to beat my Brandeis cohorts who are unfortunately dressed in green and white instead of red, white, and blue like our home team here. But that's a different discussion, and maybe you can write a book on Red Auerbach one day and discuss his implications and influence on the American culture of basketball. But anyway, my questions are as follow. President Wilson, there was actually a forum, a program just put together, shown, I should say, was put together some time ago by the famous author, name escapes me right now, it'll come to me in 1 second. Anyway, it was a 3-part series about World War I, and it focused a lot on Wilson. And it had an emphasis on, unfortunately, some aspects of his racism, his anti-Semitism, and his small-mindedness, the way he approached certain things. I think he was from Staunton, Virginia, if not mistaken. Woodrow Wilson, not Lloyd D. Brandeis.
Yeah.
And a lot of his upbringing is from that point. First part is, what really drove him, I mean, from everything you learned about him to sort of move beyond that way that he thought, small-mindedness, which is actually exemplified in the show about why he was so emphatic, meaning Wilson, about the 14 points. He wanted them to go in exactly as he wanted them, and if Congress wouldn't pass them the way he wanted, he didn't want it done at all. And it was unfortunate, but to allow Brandeis to become the Supreme Court justice. And the second part is, has to do with Paul's graph, a gentleman mentioned over there. Yeah. What jurisprudence did particularly Cardozo and Brandeis add in the area of causation and torts that's famous today? And
well, I may defer to my legal colleague here in Scala about the Paul's graph decision, or to my son in the audience if he's he's a law student. But that I don't. And a brilliant one, I'd say. But okay.
I think it's fair to say, scanning the audience, I think it's fair to say that it would be more challenging to pick somebody here
who's not
without legal training.
That's right,
than with
like
legal
myself.
training.
But let me answer the other question. It's one of the ironies is that we know now Woodrow Wilson was a racist. We now know now that he reintroduced segregation into the capital to the nation. On the other hand, he was in his own way philo-Semitic. And it's when he was the president of Princeton, he appointed the first Jewish faculty member at Princeton. When he was governor of New Jersey, before he ran for president, he appointed the first Jewish New Jersey State Supreme Court justice. And in addition, besides Brandeis, who he stuck with, he didn't abandon him after he appointed several Jews from Bernard Baruch, who was one of his close advisors, to, I'm trying to, the whole Federal Reserve system was the brainchild of one of the Warburgs, I think, who was a close advisor, and he had many Jewish advisors. So there's no record of his being anti-Semitic, and that's, but there is certainly a growing record. Some of you may have followed at Princeton University. There was an effort now to take off the Wilson name from the Woodrow Wilson School of International Affairs, etc. But that would be my answer, and it seems to be a paradox that he really was not anti-Semitic from any record that we have, but he was, certainly a Southern racist.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, last question from the left,
my
and we
friend
will
Troy,
end on time.
Rabbi, you talked a lot about Harvard Law School.
You have to identify yourself.
You talked. He identified me. I'm Tevi
Well,
Troy.
Tevi Troy.
So you talked a lot about Harvard Law School and Yale Law School, and we know that all of the Supreme Court justices right now graduated from either Harvard or Yale.
Yes.
Can you, say, did any of these Jewish justices not go to one of these elite law schools? And also, can you talk about the role of the elite law schools in kind of normalizing or kosherizing, if you will, these justices so that it was
That's
okay
right.
that they'd be on the Supreme Court?
Well, okay. I mean, what's interesting, of course, with Or the only thing, I'll just mention Merrick Garland for a minute. When he was nominated, his religion last year was not mentioned at all. The only thing the media caught upon that he would be the 9th justice to have gone to Harvard or Yale Law School. Now, I'm trying to think, okay, Brandeis, of course, Harvard Law School, okay. Cardozo went to Columbia, a fairly good law school, might I say. Frankfurter, top of his class at Harvard Law School. Now, Goldberg went to Northwestern, a very good law school, not officially Ivy League, but a tremendously good law school. Fortas went to Yale, of course. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, by the way, went to Harvard and Columbia. And it's interesting, she followed her husband. He was a year ahead of her. When he moved to New York to get a job, she went to Columbia. And she's the only, not only woman, I think one of the few people in history who was on 2 law reviews, the Harvard and Columbia Law Review. Stephen Breyer went, of course, to Stanford as an undergraduate and Harvard Law School. And, Elena Kagan went to Princeton and Harvard Law School. So it does say a part of the acculturation was that, once again, the decline of anti-Semitism in the legal profession. It was A. Lawrence Lowell, who you'll read about all in my book, hopefully, who led the anti-Semitic opposition, the president of Harvard, to Brandeis's appointment. And he later achieved much more notoriety trying to introduce a quota on Jewish admissions to Harvard in the 1920s. But it was through these Jewish students who grew up, Frankfurter, Fortas, and Goldberg were all the first members of their family to go to college. And then they went to these very prestigious law schools. And so it was part of the greater acceptance in the law schools that helped helped bring about a decrease of anti-Semitism in the legal profession. And just to end this on one story that's very interesting, I think, when Brandeis's daughter, and I believe it's Mr. Gilbert's mother, graduated at the top of her class at Bryn Mawr, Brandeis was very interested, and she had hoped, at least it's a story that I'm told, to have gone to Harvard or Yale or Columbia. The problem was in 1917, there were no women yet admitted, and each of the deans said they would love to admit her, but it would be another 10 years before they would admit women. So she went to not a bad law school, the University of Chicago, where she met her husband, another law student. But I think it's what you said. As the there was a gradual decline of anti-Semitism in the American legal profession, and it was fostered in part by so many of these lawyers who were either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants whose parents had never gone to college, going to the top elite law schools in the country and doing well there, and then having distinguished legal careers deriving from that.
Thank you all very much. It's been a great audience.
Great. This is good? Okay.
Yeah.
I hope so. What do you say about this? Yeah.
We're going this way.